Some places stop being places. They keep their shape. The walls hold. The timbers still meet at the corners they were nailed at. But something underneath has changed, and once it changes, it doesn't change back. A note before this one begins. If what you're about to hear is the kind of story you'd want more of, I've put 10 of them into an audiobook, The Hollow Files. 5 hours, 10 counties. Same voice as the one you're listening to now. You'll find the link in the description and at the top of the comments. Now then, the story. Before we go any further, tell me something. Where are you listening from tonight? Leave it down in the comments. I like knowing where the voices are landing. A porch in Tennessee, a truck cab outside Calgary, somebody's kitchen at 2:00 in the morning in a country I've never been to. Tell me. It helps. The men who went down into the Verlin shaft in the autumn of 1917 did not come back the way they went in. That is the cleanest sentence I know for what happened, and it is also a lie of omission because 4 of them did come back. They walked out under their own weight. They breathed. They answered to their names when called, but anyone who had known them before, anyone who had drunk coffee with them or stood next to them at the Assier's window, would tell you quietly after a few drinks that the men who walked out of that mine were not entirely the same men who had walked in. The Verlin sat in a narrow draw about 11 miles west of a town called Pelletour in the high country of what is now central Colorado. It had been opened in 1871 by a Welshman named Austin Price, who had come over with a wave of hard rock men brought in to chase silver out of the Rockies. Price was a small, careful man with eyes the color of wet slate, and he had a habit, the other miners said, of stopping in the middle of a passage and just listening. Not for water, not for the timbers, for something else. He never told them what. The vein he found was good for about 9 years. By 1880, the silver had thinned out, and Price sold the claim to a consortium out of Denver, who poured money into deeper drifts and pulled out in total about a third of what they spent. The shaft sat idle from 1886 until the autumn of 1917, when the war drove the price of certain trace metals up high enough that somebody in an office decided the Verlin was worth a second look. The crew they sent in was 11 men. I want to tell you their names because the records still have them, and because names are most of what's left. The foreman was a Norwegian by the name of Sigurd Lona, 46 years old, broad through the shoulders, with a beard that had gone white at the chin and stayed black at the jaw. He had worked iron mines in Minnesota for 20 years before he came west. His hands, by all accounts, were the size of dinner plates and as hard as the rock he broke. He spoke careful, slow English with the consonants of his first language still pressing through, and he was known among his men as fair, quiet, and slow to anger, which in that line of work was a kind of reputation worth more than wages. Under him were the second man, a Cornish hard rock miner named Trevenin Roskarek, 38, lean as a fence rail, and missing the small finger of his left hand. He had a way of humming low to himself in the drifts, old hymns from the chapel his mother had dragged him to as a boy, and the other men said you could find him in the dark by the sound of it. There was a Slovenian timberman named Andrej Pernat, 29, sandy-haired and serious, whose job it was to set the supports and read the wood for signs of strain. There was a young powderman from Pennsylvania named Cashin Drebeck, 24, with the soot of his trade worked permanently into the creases around his eyes. There was a hoistman named Oris Vash, who ran the cage from the surface and almost never went underground himself. There was a mucker, a man who shoveled the broken rock into the ore cars, called Pemberton Sayer, 33, tall and stooped from his work. There was a second mucker, Wilmer Tully, 26, fresh from a mine in West Virginia where his older brother had died the previous summer in a roof fall. There was a trammer who pushed the ore cars on the rails named Loris Quaintance, who at 31 was already going gray the way some men do early. There was a second timberman, Beringer Falakis, who at 42 had been doing the work since he was old enough to swing a hammer. There was a pumpman named Calder Mossep, who tended to the pump that kept the lower workings from flooding, and there was the engineer the company had sent up from Denver to assess the second pull, a man called Henrik Vandermeer, 51, whose suit always looked a little too clean for where he was. 11 men, 4 came back. It started the way these stories always do, with something small enough to dismiss. On the third day of the work, Pernet the timberman came up the cage at the end of his shift and asked Vasha the hoistman, who had been singing down in the 800 level. Varsha, who had been at the controls all afternoon, said he hadn't heard any singing. Piernot shrugged. He said it had sounded like a woman's voice far off, and that he'd thought maybe somebody was playing a phonograph against the rock wall as a joke. Varsha laughed and said there wasn't a phonograph within 40 miles. Piernot went home that night and didn't speak about it again until much later. On the fifth day, Wilmer Tully, the young mucker, came up the cage and refused to go back down. He sat on a stump near the headframe with his hands hanging between his knees. And when Luna, the foreman, came over to ask him what the matter was, Tully said only that he had felt someone standing behind him in the drift, and that when he had turned, there had been no one there. But the air where the person should have been had been very cold. Luna, who was a practical man and who had also lost his own brother in a mine in his younger years, did not laugh at him. He gave the young man the rest of the day off and told him to come back in the morning. Tully came back. He went down. He did not refuse again. But the men who worked near him on the 800 level said he stopped humming, stopped whistling, stopped making any sound at all when he worked, as if he were trying very hard not to be noticed. By the 8th day, the strangeness had begun to spread. Lamps went out for no reason in places where the air was good. Tools moved between shifts. A pick set down against the wall on the night shift would be found on the morning shift leaned against a different wall 50 ft down the drift, with no record of anyone having walked between them. Roskara, the Cornish second, kept a small leather notebook in his shirt pocket in which he wrote down each instance, careful and methodical, the way another man might record yields. By the end of the second week, his notebook held 47 entries. He showed it to Lund on a Tuesday evening. The two of them sat in the foreman's shack at the surface by a small stove, and Lund read through the entries one by one slowly, the way he did everything. When he finished, he closed the notebook and handed it back across the table. "You think it's a ghost," he said. Roskara took the notebook back and held it on his lap. He did not say yes. He did not say no. After a while he said, "I think it's a place. I think the place is something." Lund sat with that for a long time. He had been in mines for 30 years. He had felt the things you feel when the rock decides it wants you, and he had walked away from drifts that other foremen had told him were sound, and the drifts had come down a week later, and he had been right about everyone. He believed in what his bones told him. His bones that night were telling him to walk away from the Verlin and not come back. But he had 11 men, and there was a war on, and the company in Denver was paying very well, and so he did what foremen have always done in such moments. He decided to give it one more week, a breath here before what comes next. If this voice is one you want to spend more time with, I keep a longer collection, the hollow files, 10 cases, 5 hours. The same kind of quiet trouble I'm telling you about now. The link is in the description below and pinned at the top of the comments. Let's go back to the story. The week he gave them did not end the way he had planned. On the third day of that week, which was the 17th day of the work overall, the powder men Cash and Drabik went down at the start of the morning shift with a load of charges to set in a new section of the 800 level. He went down with the trammer Loris Quentance, who was bringing an empty ore car along the rail for the broken rock. Birdknot the timberman went down 10 minutes later to check the supports in the same section. 3 men. At 10:00 in the morning, Vash the hoistman heard the bell ring in the pattern that meant lift the cage. He lifted it. The cage came up empty. He thought at first that someone had pulled the cord by mistake. It happened occasionally. He sent the cage back down. Nothing. He sent it down again. Nothing. He rang the surface bell for the foreman. When Lorna came, the two of them tried the signal line and got no answer. They sent a man down in the cage, a man named Pemberton Sayer, the elder mucker, with a lantern and a whistle. Sayer went down. After about 20 minutes, the bell rang in a frantic pattern that did not match any standard signal. Vash hauled the cage up as fast as the gear would let him. When it reached the surface, Sayer was inside sitting on the floor of the cage with his back against the wall, and he was shaking the way a man shakes when his fever has just broken. He looked at Lorna, he looked at Vash. He said, "There's no one down there. The lights are still on. The carts are where they should be. There's no one." Lorna went down himself. He took with him Beringer folks, the older timberman, and Wilmer Tully, the young mucker, because Tully had been at the 800 level just the previous shift and knew the new section. The three of them went down with lanterns and ropes and a pistol that Lorna kept oiled and clean in a drawer in the shack, though he did not like to carry it and had not fired it in 8 years. They were down for nearly 4 hours. When they came up alone, the three of them. No Drebeck, no Catons, no Pernat. Luna went straight to the shack and wrote out a telegram to the Denver office. The telegram, which still exists in a county archive, reads as follows: 3 men missing in 800 level. Section clear. No fall, no water, no bodies. Sending all remaining crew topside. Stop work pending investigation. He sent the telegram. He came back out of the shack. The remaining 6 men, plus Vandermeer the engineer who had come up earlier in the day, were waiting near the headframe in the cold sun. Luna looked at them. He told them in the careful, slow way he had that nobody was going back down until they understood what had happened. He told them to gather their things. He told them they would camp at the surface that night, all of them together, and that in the morning a party from the sheriff's office would come up from Pelater. Then he went into the shack and sat down on the cot at the back of it and did not come out again until well after dark. What happened that night between the end of his telegram and the arrival of the sheriff's party the next morning has been the subject of more arguments than anything else about the Verlin. I'll tell you what is in the record, which is not very much. And I'll tell you what was reconstructed afterward from the men who survived, which is more than was ever written down, and I'll let you decide for yourself which of it is true. The men camped near the headframe that night, the way Luna had told them to. They lit a fire. Vandermeer the engineer, who had brought a flask of whiskey up from Denver, passed it around, and the men drank from it in turn, even Tully, who normally did not drink. They did not say very much. Around midnight, by Vash's pocket watch, the bell at the top of the head frame began to ring. It was the bell that connected to the signal line in the cage. It rang in the pattern that meant a man at the bottom wanted to be lifted to the surface. Vasha, who had been half asleep against a packing crate, sat up. He looked at the bell, he looked at the others. The bell stopped and then started again, the same pattern. Lift the cage. There was no one at the bottom to lift. The men looked at each other across the firelight. Roskarek, the Cornish second, stood up slowly and walked over to the head frame. He looked at the bell, which had gone quiet. He looked down the shaft into the dark. He came back to the fire and sat down without saying anything. The bell rang a third time 20 minutes later, same pattern. Luna, who had been silent the whole evening, stood up at last and said, "Anyone who goes down that shaft tonight, I will personally drag back up by his collar. We wait for the sheriff." Nobody went down. The bell rang again at about 3:30 in the morning. By then, the men had stopped flinching at it. They sat around the fire and listened to it without speaking. The hoistman, Vasha, later said that the strangest part was not the bell itself, but the pattern, which was very precise, the way only a trained miner would ring it. Random pulls on the rope make a chaotic noise. This was not chaotic. This was a man somewhere signaling that he wanted to come up. The sheriff's party arrived at sunrise. The sheriff was a man named Carwin Llewellyn, 58, who had been the sheriff of that county for 16 years and who had been a mining man himself before that. He brought 3 deputies and a doctor up from Telluride. He listened to what Luna told him, and he listened without interrupting. And when Luna was finished, he asked only one question, which was whether the bell was still ringing. Luna said it had not rung since just before dawn. Llewellyn took 2 of his deputies and Luna and Ross Kiro down into the shaft. They were down for 6 hours. When they came back up, the sheriff sat on a rock near the headframe for a long time before he said anything. The doctor offered him water. He drank it. He looked at his deputies. He looked at Luna. He looked at the remaining men who had been waiting on the surface. He said, "Pack everything up. We're sealing the shaft." He would not say what he had seen. There are 3 records of what Llewellyn told people afterward, all of them second-hand, all of them slightly different, and none of them complete. One was a letter the doctor wrote to his sister in St. Louis the following spring, in which he described the sheriff as having come out of the shaft looking like a man who had been told the date of his own death. A second was an account that one of the deputies, a young man named Ivor Pendley, gave to a newspaper man in Denver some 12 years later after Llewellyn was dead and could no longer object. Pendley told the newspaper man that they had walked the entire 800 level and found nothing. No bodies, no tools left where they shouldn't be, no signs of struggle. But he said that in the section where the three men had been working, there was a smell he had never been able to describe afterward, and that the air had been so cold in that particular place that his breath had clouded in front of him, and that the lanterns had dimmed without going out, as if something nearby were drinking the light. The third record was a single line in Llewellyn's own ledger, in his own hand, written on the day he came back from the Verlin. The line reads, "We do not have the right to go further." Seal it. He sealed it. The shaft was filled with broken rock and timbers within the week, and a concrete cap was poured over the top of it the following spring. The company in Denver was not pleased. There were letters, threats, eventually a lawsuit that went nowhere because, by the time it came to court, the war had ended and the trace metals were no longer worth what they had been. The Verlin was forgotten by the company, and the men who had been on it were paid out and dispersed. But here is where the story does not end. Of the 11 men who went down into the Verlin, 4 came back to the surface and stayed. Sigvard Luna, the foreman, went back to Minnesota. He bought a small farm with his savings and lived there for the rest of his life. He never went into a mine again. His wife, in a letter to her sister written in 1923, said that he slept poorly, that he kept a lantern lit in their bedroom every night until he died, and that on certain nights of the year in the autumn, he would sit on the porch and not come in until the sky began to brighten, and that he would not answer her when she asked him what he was waiting for. Trevennan Roscarrock, the Cornish second, went back to his home county in England and never spoke of America again. He died in 1930, one of a chest illness that may or may not have been related to his years in the mines. His notebook with the 47 entries was found in a drawer after his death and was eventually given to a small mining museum in Camborne, where it remains today. Visitors can ask to see it. Most people, when they read it, put it down within the first few pages. Wilmer Tully, the young mucker, stayed in Colorado. He took work at a hardware store in Pelaton and married a woman named Hesper Quincy from a nearby ranch. He lived to be 72. He had a habit in his later years of locking every door in the house before he went to bed and of checking the latches twice. His wife told her grandchildren after Tully was dead that he had once told her, very late at night and only once, that what he had seen in the 800 level on the day Drabeck and Quentin and Pernot disappeared was not nothing. She would not say what he had said. The grandchildren asked, she would not say. Pemberton Sayer, the elder mucker, did not last as long as the others. He went down to California after the Verlin closed. He took a job on a road crew and then another job on a citrus farm, and then he disappeared from the records entirely for about 3 years. He surfaced again in 1921 in a sanitarium in Sacramento, where a doctor by the name of Linus Holdsworth treated him for what was then called nervous exhaustion. Holdsworth kept careful notes on his patients. The Sayer notes survive, and they include a passage in which Sayer, in the second week of his treatment, told Holdsworth that he believed he had been followed out of the Verlin by something that he could not see, but that he could sometimes hear, particularly at night and particularly when he was alone. Holdsworth asked him what he heard. Sayers said, "A bell ringing in the pattern." Sayers died in 1923. The cause of death on his certificate is heart failure. He was 40 years old. I want to slow down here for a moment because I think it's important. The temptation with a story like this one is to push toward the explanation, to tell you that the missing men were murdered, or that the shaft collapsed in a way the sheriff covered up, or that there was a gas pocket in the rock that produced hallucinations, and that everything else is just the embroidery of frightened men. Any of those things may be true. None of them, taken alone, accounts for everything that is in the record. Here is what I think you should sit with for a minute. A bell rang in the pattern that meant a man wanted to come up. There was no man at the bottom of that shaft. The sheriff, who was a hard, practical, mining-bred man, went down and came back up and sealed it, and would not say why. A young man on his first shift felt someone standing behind him in the dark, and there was no one there, and the air where the person should have been had been very cold. He lived another 50 years and locked every door in his house twice every night. A Cornish hard rock miner wrote 47 entries in a notebook.